What's going on, guys? This is Rob. Still not feeling my best, so I apologize if I'm not crazy overexcited. Stomach just bothering me a little bit. But it's been a while since we have covered the X-Men, so I figured we'd kind of get back into it again. Now, all this takes place after the events of Sins of Sinister, and as most of you guys kind of figured out, Sins of Sinister, as interesting as it was just kind of a pointless event, didn't really serve any useful purpose that we're aware of. But the thing about this is that this actually focuses on the X-Men returning to the Children of the Vault. Now, we'll talk about that here in a second, but in effect, this is the Children of the Vault killing the Marvel Universe. Now, the cool thing about this is that what Forge has been doing is actually just running a series of simulations. Now, a little bit of discussion here for a second about the Children of the Vault and Forge. Forge is a character that is very obscure, even to the most reasonable comic book reader, if they're not seriously reading the X-Men and haven't really been reading the X-Men for a long time. But Forge is like the mutant population's version of Tony Stark, that his mutant power is his super intelligence, specifically with regards to computer systems. So much like Tony Stark, Forge can reverse engineer or even engineer virtually anything he can think of. But if you take his mutant power away, the guy would probably have a hard time operating an iPhone, right? I mean, that's just kind of the nature of his power. But what Forge has been doing with regards to the Children of the Vault is running simulations to figure out what would happen if the Children of the Vault were to escape. Now, in order to explain that, the way the Children of the Vault were originally introduced to us back in 2006 is that it was actually an experiment by humanity to basically hyper-evolve humans to essentially use them as a means to get rid of the mutant population. And so within the vault itself, time passes differently. It really kind of accelerates more than anything else. So what would feel like 15 minutes outside the vault is potentially 200 or 300 years within the vault. And so when Jonathan Hickman took over the X-Men and brought the Children of the Vault back, what he showed us is that in the far-flung future, seemingly at the end of the mutant population, a war always broke out between the human and machine alliance, the post-humans, which is what the Children of the Vault become, and the mutant population, and that they all had their own individual goals, but in the end, it always led to the destruction, the complete and utter destruction of the mutant population in one form or another. And so the result of this is that there's always kind of this lingering fear of the Children of the Vault, what it means if they were to escape. And so in running these simulations, what Forge had come to the realization of is that if the children were to escape, because of the fact that they are hyper-evolved beings that basically learn from every experience that they have, they would take out Krakoa within the first day. They would literally wipe out the entirety of the Krakoan island. Now, I want to specify here, this is no small thing. Virtually every mutant in existence resides on Krakoa. Now, one of the ways at which Marvel's even able to get away with this stuff right now, when it comes to the events of Sins of Sinister or this particular set of circumstances, is remember, when it comes to Franklin Richards, Marvel depowered him, right? He's not a mutant with reality warping abilities anymore. He's just a kid that exists out there. Otherwise, this would have been almost impossible to get away with. Franklin could just walk up and snap his fingers and everything gets taken care of, and like that's the end of that. He's a giant walking, talking MacGuffin is basically what he is. But in the absence of that, Krakoa falls in one day. The following day after that, the Children of the Vault take out the entirety of the Avengers. And then within the third day, and probably within like a few weeks after that, following defeats, retreat to the vault, basically learning and then developing new abilities to counter the powers that had killed them in the first place, they reemerge, they take on Asgard, and they wipe out Asgard. And it just repeats itself over and over and over again, to the point that, in effect, these post-humans wipe out the entirety of the Marvel Universe within an exceedingly short amount of time, right? It's not like it was with Sins of Sinister, where it took the mutant population hundreds of years to completely conquer the universe. No, this happens within probably 1 year, right? 1 year after emerging from the vault, the children wipe out everything and they conquer the entirety of the universe, just like that. And in fact, even Dr. Doom falls. And one of the things they specify is that with Dr. Doom, and specifically Latveria, that's where all the magic wielders retreat. Doctor Strange, well, really Clea, because Doctor Strange is already dead at that point in time, but like Jericho Drum, all those guys, Dr. Doom is like the last man standing, the last human in existence. And in one of the coolest moments that Dr. Doom has, he's like, this is not over. when you get to hell, I'll be waiting for you. Like, it's the most Doctor Doom thing to say before he gets annihilated. But it's just this really, really cool depiction. Now, I love the way that Marvel does this because they don't like turn it into an event, right? It's not like this big crossover event. Marvel could have done that. It's just kind of a half-assed cash grab, but they decided not to. And I love that they didn't, because running the simulations and coming to the realization, this is the only way that this scenario can play out. What Forge does is he constructs an entire dome around the entrance to the Children of the Vault. So when they emerge, this entire version of them conquering everything in existence is all a simulation for them. It's not actually happening. They just believe that it does, and it keeps them passive. Right? It keeps them under control, right? It keeps them believing that they've dominated everything, so there's no reason for them to look any further. It's a pretty smart maneuver by Forge in order to keep their greatest threat completely and totally under their control. Here's the problem, right? In the early days when Hickman was writing the X-Men, there was a mission that was undertaken by the X-Men themselves to investigate the Vault before any of this stuff unfolded. You had Synch, you had Darwin, and you had Laura Kinney X-23. Now, Laura Kinney X-23, most all of you guys know who she is, right? Like the female clone of Wolverine. Darwin is an Omega level mutant that has the ability to adapt to anything. And in fact, in this comic, that dude basically becomes godlike in terms of his powers. It's kind of nuts, and we'll talk about that as we get through this. Synch was the only one who was able to escape. Now, Synch has the ability to basically duplicate the powers of anybody around him. More recently, his power has been elevated to a higher level, so he can copy multiple abilities at once, and he doesn't have to be around them anymore to do it. It's like pulling out cards from a Rolodex. It's awesome, right? He's basically Peter Petrelli from Heroes, right? It's just, he is, I would argue he's probably the most powerful mutant that Marvel has right now in this moment, right? This guy is ridiculously OP because it feels like there's no upper limit to the powers that he possesses. The problem with this is that even though he was able to escape, he was in the Vault for hundreds of years. He and Laura Kinney, they built a life together, had a romantic relationship going on. But when he made his escape, he never talks about what went on inside the Vault. And with Laura and Darwin still being stuck there, he's really just seems to be dealing with a combination of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So he just won't talk about any of it at all. It's just one of those weird things, and the telepaths could poke and prod, but they choose not to. The reason why this is all important is because what Forge does is basically orchestrate a rescue mission for Darwin to focus on him, because with Darwin's ability to adapt, one, it's believed that Laura Kinney's dead, and two, because Darwin can adapt to anything, he's most likely survived, and given his longevity and everything he's witnessed in the Vault, the information he could bring back would be paramount, not just because of the fact that it would allow the X-Men to withstand virtually any assault by the Children of the Vault if they were to escape the dome, but also because it could actually allow the X-Men to expand their own abilities and become more powerful than they are right now. And so what we end up learning is that even around the dome, as a kind of safety measure to make sure that nobody could just break in there, that Forge had set it up so the dome would develop its own ecosystem, i.e. its own kind of security force. Now, it's not as though they answer to the X-Men, they're designed to be autonomous. And Forge really even makes this case because if he were to die, the dome would fail and there would be no protection from the Children of the Vault emerging. And so what this meant is that there had to be some kind of additional security there. So these guys are, I mean, they're okay. I mean, they're not overly powerful. The Sentries are dealt with pretty readily by the X-Men, which really begs the question, how relevant could these guys be if the X-Men could overcome them? I mean, you would think that Forge would have some kind of security installed that not even the X-Men could get around it, but if that were the case, how in the world did they get inside the Vault in the first place? So it's kind of a finicky situation. But what ends up happening is Forge uses a suit of his own design, using a combination of Mystique's abilities to basically take on a physical form other than her own, as well as DNA that belonged to Caliban. Now, Caliban is a mutant that has the ability to track down any other mutants within a particular range, right? I'm going to say it's like 2 or 3 miles, but that's fluctuated over the years in Marvel Comics. And in fact, there's been stories where Caliban can track the movements of mutants around the world, right? So it really just depends on who's telling the story at that point in time. But using these two abilities, what it does is it allows Forge to appear as one of the Children of the Vault when he enters, but using the powers of Caliban, it allows him to track the location of Darwin, as long as Caliban knows what Darwin's signal is, which Caliban does. And so as he enters into the Vault, one of the things that happens is he passes by supply these kind of stasis pods, which basically house what we could call the core members of the children, or the ones that basically are the ones that lead the assault against everybody else. And so because of the nature of their powers and the fact that their powers are so advanced, the only way to pacify them is to keep them in stasis pods and keep them locked there, right? Because even with this dome and this whole simulation and everything, that it does serve a purpose, right? Most everybody else that's inside the main vault itself, they're just living out their lives, right? The ones who are like wiping everything out in existence, this is the dream they're living inside those pods. But as long as they're contained and as long as they're kept in stasis, everything's going to be copacetic, right? Like everything's going to be fine. And so what ends up going on is that once Forge passes through, we end up finding that within the vault itself is an entire civilization. Millions of people live there, right? And they all have varying degrees of powers. We don't really know what their powers are, except for the ones that are inside those stasis pods, but there's a whole civilization down there. They live their lives, they form family bonds and all kinds of stuff, right? They pair off and couple and all those different things. It's cool. Like, it's a really, really cool concept. But donning the appearance of Pero, right? Like one of the children of the vault, and kind of walking around through there, no one seems to be any the wiser except for one person, and we'll find out who they are. But one of the other issues that transpires is Scott Summers and Alex Summers get into a fight. Now, this isn't new. These guys fight all the time. They've been doing it since the introduction of Havoc into the X-Men comics, and even when he was on X Factor, they fight like cats and dogs, and they're brothers, so it makes perfect sense. The problem is that given the fight between the two of them, when Cyclops is punched by Havoc and knocks his visor off his face, an optic blast fires off, and it hits one of the stasis pods, which frees the real Pero, right? Like the actual guy who believes that they've conquered everything. When he reemerges, he comes to the realization they were duped. They were tricked. The entire stasis pod was like an illusion. They didn't conquer anything. And so what follows is not overly important. It's basically a conflict between like the X-Men and this one guy. But it is worth covering here for a couple different reasons. One of the first things that happens is he punches Iceman and shatters him. Now, that doesn't matter, right? For Bobby Drake, he can just turn into a liquid form, piece himself back together, and come back, right? He's basically invulnerable so long as he's able to access the different portions of himself. But one of the things he points out is that this guy is as strong as the Incredible Hulk, which basically shows how it is that even just on the front of strength, they were able to overtake most all the Avengers and the X-Men, right? And then following that, the rest of the X-Men step in and basically fight where they can, when they can. But for the most part, they're not able to do a whole lot in terms of just brunt strength facing off against this guy. A lot of it really comes down to Jean using her telepathic powers in order to take over this guy's mind, pacify him, convince him that what's been going on right now is a nightmare, and the reality, or at least the idea of them conquering everything, that's the true world he lives in. They put him back in the stasis pod and everything's more or less sorted out. Not the biggest deal in the world, but it does show just how capable this guy is and the level of power just one of these children of the vault possesses. And that's the funny thing, right? Say, for example, that this guy were able to, at the very least, not really kill the X-Men, but like incapacitate them and head back into the vault, that he would be subjected to kind of, I wouldn't say reconditioning, but like a restructuring of his powers given the fight he had with the X-Men, and then in turn, he would come out stronger than he was before. So it's kind of a cool thing, right? It's he's almost kind of like those are guys who are familiar with Doomsday from DC Comics. Think of all the children of the vault operating in that capacity, right? They're always just kind of reworked, restructured, and improved upon given their previous failings. But switching back to Forge, because the real Pero is thrown back into a stasis vault, it allows Forge to continue on masquerading as Pero. Once he gets past the security with the main vault itself and the AI that's constantly working to improve the different members of the children here, that once he gets in, he realizes Laura Kinney's actually alive. Right? She's alive and she's being kept there and is constantly feeding on her DNA in order to restructure and to develop new abilities within the children of the vault itself. This is where their healing factor comes from, right? Each one of them, whenever it is that they are injured, they basically experience the healing factor of Laura Kinney, and it allows them to survive. But the Laura Kinney healing factor is constantly improved upon with each generation of the children of the vault being reworked and restructured and sent back out again. So it's cool. The problem with this is that Forge says that she's not the mission, And so Forge puts her back in stasis, right? He just kind of walks away, which is kind of a shady thing, but it also makes sense at the same time, because trying to launch a rescue mission for 2 people when one is going to be a struggle in and of itself, it would basically turn into a suicide mission. And the reality here is that even with Caliban attached to him, that if the children of the Vault were able to get their hands on the power of Caliban, then there would be no escape. There'd be no way to get out of this, right? There'd be no way to get away from this. And the biggest reason why is because where a war could break out between the children of the Vault and the Marvel Universe, specifically the X-Men could run and hide, they could marshal their forces, they could gather back together, they could launch another attack. But with the power of Caliban at the children of the Vault's disposal, that in turn, there would be nowhere for the X-Men to hide. That ultimately the AI would basically evolve the powers of Caliban to where it could determine the location of any mutant on Earth, anywhere in the Earth, and it would only be a matter of time before all the X-Men are hunted down. There's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere they could retreat to. Maybe space, they could take off into space, but even then, they would eventually be found, right? So it's a really kind of an interesting moment, because what happens is Forge realizes that, okay, our main mission is to find Darwin, but I don't know where this guy is. Enter Serafina, and that's the person that we find out has actually been following Forge around this entire time, because she seemingly realized right off the bat that Forge is not the real Para. Now, a lot of this seems to be due to the fact that as soon as he entered the Vault, it took him a minute or two, but then he put on his disguise. She seems to have spotted him between that time period and has just been following him around. Now, Serafina, she's interesting and unique among the children of the Vault. I would not go so far as to say that she is the most powerful, although admittedly, as she appears now, that seems to be the case, but we don't definitively know the nature of her powers now versus before. When we originally saw her, she was a technopath, meaning she could interface with technology. She could like teleport, she could cloak herself, right? She had the ability to throw basically adamantium knives, although it was kind of an unstable version of adamantium, so it wasn't as like pure or good as like Wolverine's adamantium that's bonded to his bones. What she looks like here is she looks like she's a walking, talking adamantium being, right? Like her entire body is encased in adamantium. Now, even if it is the unstable version that normally makes up her knives, it still makes her incredibly durable, and I would go as far as to say almost indestructible. If it is a purified version of adamantium, or even a more pure version than the one that Wolverine has, there's no way to kill this girl. There's absolutely no way to destroy her outside of some high-level reality warping character who could disperse her molecules across the cosmos. There's seemingly no possible way to destroy this chick using brute force, most likely even telepathy, because even given something like Magneto's helmet that can block telepathic thoughts from entering his head, surely the children of the Vault had considered that and adapted it. But of course, the funny thing about this is that she's not really interested in killing Forge. If anything, she's more interested in gaining information. Specifically, she asks him, are you the one responsible for constructing the trap outside of the Vault door? Basically, this illusion that the children of the Vault successfully conquer everything in existence. The response of Forge is yes. Now, the reason he's being truthful here is because she told him, if you lie, I'll kill you on the spot. And she would. Right? Like she would literally kill him right there. So it's in his best interest to tell the truth. And so when she asked the question, why, he said the alternative was simply war. And she says, correct again. What was the ulterior motive? And he says, because I wanted to see what would happen. And she says, I believe you. And that's the same reason I'm allowing you to take your mutant and go. My scales are balanced. I want to see how this will end. So it's really more curiosity than anything else. Now, a lot of this is also due to the fact that if the X-Men were not concerned about the power of the children of the Vault, they would not have constructed this entire illusion in the first place. But the fact that they did that basically shows that they're concerned about the children of the Vault emerging, and that most likely it was an act of self-preservation, i.e. the X-Men saw their own death with the children of the Vault. And so her response here is really more rooted in the idea of, I'm not worried about you because I know that we would end up killing you anyway. And like, that's it. And she walks away. It's the ultimate power play. It's really, really awesome. Now, the issue here is that given the injury that Forge sustained, he ultimately passes out. And when he does, he wakes up in what he perceives as being his grand vision for what Krakoa would look like. And I'll be honest, it looks pretty dope. Like, it's a very utopian landscape, far more grand in scale than Krakoa as it exists right now. But what ends up happening is that as he makes his way through here, he's basically met by Darwin. Now, that's one of the things that I want to point out here, and this is why I say Darwin has achieved a whole new level of power, because what Darwin reveals to Forge here is that he has no physical form anymore. He did at one point in time, and given the fact that his body could adapt to virtually any situation, the AI was constantly experimenting on him. And in fact, he even refers to it as a living autopsy, right? Like they were cutting up in his head, they were experimenting on his brain, they were doing all kinds of different things, just subjecting him to pain and torture and all that kind of stuff in the pursuit of knowledge. But eventually, Darwin broke free of his physical form. Now, this is exceedingly important here, because as an Omega level mutant that is by all standards of measurement immortal and can adapt involuntarily, right, to any situation, he's indestructible. And by being able to enter into the mind of Forge and then show him a reality that otherwise doesn't exist, I mean, this isn't Marvel giving us a definitive explanation of his powers. I would argue this guy's reached godhood now, right? I mean, he even goes as far as to tell Forge, I don't want to leave this place, right? Having no physical form, it allows me to observe these people here, to learn about these people here. I'm not ready to return. Which, this is basically just Marvel saying, hey guys, Darwin's still around, we just haven't brought him back yet. But like, we will, and things are going to pop off when he does come back, because he's now the most powerful mutant that ever existed in the history of Marvel Comics. The guy's so powerful, he doesn't need a physical form, right? I mean, how do you beat a guy like that? Right? That's just a disembodied voice that can control the world around him. I mean, it's insane. And so in response to that, Forge does the only thing he can do. He actually ends up grabbing Laura Kinney and then making their escape. And so once they get out, you have the X-Men that contact Synch, and Synch, despite a total unwillingness to return to the vault, due to his loyalty as an X-Man and to the rest of the team, shows up here. And initially he thinks it's like a massive problem and a huge issue, only to find out that it's not, that it's basically the revelation that Laura Kinney's here. Now, Cyclops tells Synch, hey man, she might need a little bit of time. We should give her time to kind of come to terms and to figure out everything that's going on. Nope, Laura Kinney goes running up on Synch. And I think we all know what's gonna follow here, right? There's gonna be a lot of touching of naughty bits between the two of them, right, for quite some time. But it's a cool story, right? It's not a great big huge action-packed story. It's not nuts. It's just kind of a transitionary story to basically see the return of Laura Kinney's character X-23 to Marvel Comics, but also establishing that Darwin is way more powerful than he's ever been. And when this guy returns to the main Marvel universe, there's no telling what this guy is going to be capable of. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.